Welcome back. This is World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The fight against the pandemic has continued across the world. There are now over 14.5 million confirmed COVID-19 cases globally, with over 606,000 deaths. Beijing has downgraded the risk level in all districts to low recently. Last month, it was hit by a sudden spike, but authorities were able to contain it. But in some other parts of the world, the coronavirus infections continue to surge, unlike the situation in Northeast Asia. In the United States, for example, total cases have now topped 3.7 million, nearly 500,000 new cases in the week, with more than 140,000 deaths. And the debate continues over whether people should still be required to wear masks. Why was mask wearing slow to catch on in the West, many wonder? And are the advantages of a Confucian culture more apparent during a crisis? We try to figure out some of the cultural differences behind the realities of the pandemic by talking to Daniel Bell, the Dean of the School of Political Science and Public Administration at Shandong University. Let's listen in. Now I'm joined by Daniel Bell, Dean of the School of Political Science and Public Administration from Shandong University. Daniel is a well-known scholar worldwide on Neo-Confucianism. Let me ask you about your take on the latest crisis regarding COVID-19, the global pandemic. What do you make of the cultural elements of how we are dealing with it?
I think one of the features of China and Chinese culture is that there's a respect for hierarchy that is grounded in superior ability and virtue. So sometimes it means respect for conscientious professionals. We can call them modern day junzi or exemplary persons. Sometimes it could be social critics, or sometimes it could be for example, Dr. Zhong Nanshan, who was famous for helping to deal with the SARS crisis in 2003. And once he sounded the alarm on this new SARS-like virus on January 20th, it's not just the government, but the people respected him and basically agreed with measures, very strong measures taken 3 days later to deal with the crisis. And there's also a respect for, we can say, a very capable government led by officials selected in a meritocratic process who will take measures in the interest of the well-being of the people. I think because of those two conditions, China effectively, well, so far anyway, dealt with this urgent crisis of COVID-19.
That is really a myth so far. Some suggest the Northeast Asian culture, more collectivism rather than individualism, and also more respect for professionals. At crisis, more unity. Is that a myth, or is it really part of the culture? Though it is hard to argue that in other cultures, at difficult times, people would not come together, right?
Well, it's part of culture, but it's not necessarily unique to China or to Confucianism or to East Asia. I mean, aspects might be shared elsewhere. For example, in the Nordic states, there's also a strong, there's also respect for very capable government that acts in the interest of the people. And there's also a commitment to social responsibility, which might be stronger in countries that have a more individualistic culture, like the United States.
Earlier, I talked to Thomas Friedman, a well-known columnist from the New York Times, and he argues that at this difficult time, that maybe the Chinese system could work when there is a public health crisis, though the so-called Western democracy system or market economy system could work well during the ordinary days when we talk about the economy or when we talk about the vibrancy of the society. Do you think, of course, that's his theory. I mean, as a cultural scholar, as a philosopher, how do you see the real difference, or it is still a myth?
So I think that it's true that when it comes to dealing with emergencies that require sacrifice by the people, generally speaking, cultures with a Confucian heritage, where there's a tradition of social responsibility, concern with social harmony, as well as combined with a kind of legalist heritage, Fajian Chinese, which is basically a strong state that values efficiency. When those two are combined, it can effectively deal with emergencies, it's especially important and hard to do in a large, diverse country such as China. I mean, if it's a small little island state, like for example, New Zealand, it's much easier to deal with crises. But in large countries like China, I do think it requires some sort of long tradition of some Confucian style and legalist style culture. Now, whether in ordinary times those can hamper progress, I mean, that's partly true but again, it depends on how for example, the Confucian culture is interpreted. I mean, one of the central Confucian values is harmony, and if you hear that in English, it sounds like conformity or uniformity, or basically blindly listen to your superiors. But any Chinese intellectual knows the saying from the Analects of Confucius, meaning that exemplary persons value harmony, not conformity, not uniformity. So there's a respect, in fact, a celebration of diversity in this Confucian ideal of harmony. And that is fully consistent with pursuit of innovation and respect for example, minority cultures. But if the Confucian idea of harmony is distorted and meant to mean uniformity or blindly and conformity, then obviously that's incompatible with economic progress and innovation in modern societies.
In Northeast culture, not many, in fact, question about the function of a mask, and people are really willing and even go out of their way in order to find a mask. However, in another culture, let's just say in the United States today, it has become such a political debate and has been totally politicized. To many here in this part of the world, it's surprising because it's some would call it common sense. However, in the other culture, it's certainly not being taken like that. So, Professor Bell, you were growing up in North America, in Canada, though. But how do you see, the interesting comparison between "quote unquote" the West and the East?
Well, the mask-wearing common sense, it's partly rooted in history. For example, in Japan, it goes back a few decades. People would wear masks not just to protect themselves, but to protect others when they have colds. I was also in Hong Kong in 2003 when there was the SARS crisis, and people knew that you had to wear masks to avoid being affected by that virus. So when it came to this new virus, in much of East Asia, there was also a kind of ready memory, so to speak, and it became common sense that there was a need to wear masks, even when the science was not 100% clear. So now the science, there's almost indisputable evidence that wearing masks is important to prevent transmission. In the United States, the country is so polarized that if one political organization or party advocates one thing, almost automatically there'll be an opposite reaction from the other side. And also because of this strong tradition of individualism, maybe even to be a bit negative, celebration of hedonism at times.
So anyone harassing me to wear a mask, you guys are violating federal law.
Which makes this mask-wearing culture more difficult to become common sense, unfortunately.
We have all been talked to our friends, right, in either Europe or Canada, the United States, when wearing a mask was still a debate there. And some of them telling us, I don't want to wear a mask because nobody else is wearing a mask. You earlier, I recall, Professor Bell, you were talking about uniformity of culture. That's pretty typical in a Confucius society, but you see also it reflects in another way in the Western society. So how should we understand this? There seems to be a lot of entangled impressions and theories.
That's true. So I guess this kind of blind conformity is not just a problem in China or in East Asia, but sometimes in Western countries too, even though people wouldn't openly recognize it as such. There's a very large community of Chinese heritage in Toronto and Vancouver who had more knowledge of what's happening in China. So they knew that this COVID-19 could become quite dangerous in the early days, and they started wearing masks. And that affected the other citizens in Toronto and Vancouver. So it became the mask wearing common sense spread more quickly. But in Montreal, so to speak, there wasn't really a community that took the front lines that became concerned with mask wearing that could influence the others to the same extent. And I think that's one reason, unfortunately, why Montreal was hard hit. There's actually more deaths in Montreal than in Wuhan, I'm sad to report.
Professor Bell is the author of several books, including The China Model, Political Meritocracy and the Limits of Democracy, China's New Confucianism, Politics and Everyday Life in a Changing Society, and East meets West, Human Rights and Democracy in East Asia. Recently, he's been planning a new book that will explore what is Chineseness. Let's hear what he reckons are the key differences between the East and the West and their impact on our societies. So that is only one of those examples, Professor Bell. If you talk about the East and the West, there are other examples existing. For example, whether people are listening to the advice of when the city is being quarantined, whether they should party on the beaches while the virus is still unpredictable. We see some cultural differences. But talking about culture, Professor Bell, I know you're also now writing a book about Chineseness. It is not necessarily a racial issue, but rather a cultural issue. We've heard that debate also when if someone learned the Chinese history, that the Chinese have always been arguing this is not just a nation state concept, but rather a cultural concept. We also have seen books in the West talking about China as a civilization rather than a nation state concept. So tell me more about what do you see as Chineseness or un-Chineseness? If you have one, you must have the other, right, Professor?
Well, that's a huge and great question.
I know, it's a big one.
I'm only at the beginning stages of writing a book that was probably going to be at least a 5-year plan, maybe even a 10-year plan. But the basic idea is throughout much of Chinese history until about the mid to late 19th century, the idea of what it meant to be Chinese was a kind of cultural idea. It depends on the language, it depends on the rituals. But in the mid to late 19th century, this is one of the worst influence of the West. There was, of course, it's more the white West, so to speak. We can even say the white distorted form of Christianity West. There was a belief that the world can be ranked according to races, and with the white race on top. And that belief was propagated by sometimes consciously so, sometimes less consciously so, by Western imperialists. And that led to a big shock in China, of course, when they were militarily defeated by Western countries. And some Chinese leading intellectuals and reformers thought they thought that the way to become powerful is to affirm our identity based on race, but changing the classification with our race on top. So this idea, I think, is unfortunately a terrible influence of Western racism. And I think there's a good reason to go back to the traditional idea of what it means to be Chinese, but of course updated for the modern world.
It's very interesting to talk about this aspect of impressions, at least, of cultures, because with issues such as Black Lives Matter, it really provides us with another updated opportunity to look at the issue of race and the issue not just about the African Americans, but also of all diversities in the world and the respect for all. Having said that, though, Professor, I want to proceed with that direction a little bit more. How do you see that China has been keeping that balance. I don't know how well, but has been keeping that balance between so-called exceptionalism and also uniqueness. So these are two different concepts. Tell me more about your observations.
Well,
another book, I know,
traditional
another
idea-
5-year plan, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the traditional view of what it means Chinese was meant to be a universal idea. I mean, when Confucians defended their values, they thought that those values, in principle, are universally applicable and can be learned by anybody in the rest of the world, and also that those values are thought to be superior to other values. Although the way to spread them is through today what we would call soft power. Generally, there was the idea that we could use military force to force people to become adherents of, for example, Confucian ethics is very just pretty crazy and didn't have much influence in history. But today, I think we recognize that some values, basic values, are universally shared, that are rooted in Confucianism and shared with other traditions. For example, we shouldn't kill innocent people, torture is bad, people have, to use modern language, a right to basic material well-being. But beyond that, I think there's a recognition that societies that don't have the tradition of Confucianism spread over hundreds of years, if not longer, through everyday life, as well as through educational systems and so on. For example, that value social harmony, or that value political meritocracy, or that value justifiable forms of social hierarchy. Then we should just allow for a difference here. And the best way for China to live up to this form of Confucianism is just to do well at home and lead by example rather than by trying to persuade or force or even try to persuade others.
Professor, my final question. We are at a time of change. Besides COVID-19, there are other huge things happening. Geopolitics is one. When we talk about geopolitics, people always talk about ideologies, even though I do not know necessarily what it meant. But how do you see, the kinds of ideologies that politicians or political scientists, including you possibly, always have in their speech vis-a-vis the cultural identity and philosophy that has been with us for much more than a nation state, much longer than a nation state, particularly modern nation state. How do you see these very different and yet possibly similar concepts?
Well, the big problem is when two representatives of cultures engage with each other, and one thinks that they hold superior views or clear, more direct access to the truth, and engage with the other as a kind of somewhat inferior person who should be, through various means, whether it's force or persuasion, learn to become like me. I mean, much of the interaction of the West has been like with China has been like that. I mean, Jonathan Spence, the historian at Yale, wrote a great book called "To Change China," where he went through the history of Western missionaries and intellectuals and businessmen who came to China eventually with the idea that China should be changed to become basically like me. And they all failed because China has its own civilization and cultural habits, among other reasons. But obviously now it's the way to engage with another culture is to, hold on to one's beliefs and try to defend them, but also be willing to learn from the other culture and change one's original standpoint in response to that engagement. It seems to me that's the only way forward now.
Okay. Daniel Bell, Dean of the School of Political Science and Public Administration from Shandong University. He's originally coming from Canada and certainly a well-known scholar on Neo-Confucianism. Thank you so much, Daniel, for helping us understand from a philosophy perspective what's really going on. Thank you. Really appreciate it.